Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review of Home, which is episode 3 of season 4 of Star Trek Enterprise. This video is part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek as determined by my user polls. The episode to win my latest user poll is the 4th season Enterprise episode Home. So Home is the episode where the Enterprise returns to Earth after facing the Xindi threat to Earth that nearly destroyed Earth, but they were successful in their mission and they were received as heroes. But Captain Archer's suffering from PTSD and is not receptive to being idolized. And meanwhile, T'Pol returns to Vulcan with Tripp and to sort of spark their romance, but once home she finds issues with her mother and her betrothed Koss, who kind of manipulates her into marrying him. And also Phlox deals with some xenophobia on Earth resulting from the Xindi threat. So in the poll I did, in the video I did for the poll, I talked about this episode and I compared it to the Next Generation episode Family, which I think is actually a very similar episode. It is the episode that came right after Best of Both Worlds that dealt with the aftermath of the Borg threat, and I think in a similar fashion this episode of course comes right after season 3, which is a season-long story arc about the Xindi threat to destroy Earth, and this is dealing with the aftermath of that and what effect that had on the characters and on society as a whole, and I think that's absolutely brilliant. Now, in the video I did earlier, I said that I thought that this episode was better than Family, quite frankly, and that it did a better job, and I stand by that entirely. I like Family. I think it was a decent episode, but I don't think it was a masterpiece. A lot of people tend to hold that episode up as amazing and great, where I do like the fact that they dealt with Picard having to deal with the after effects of the Borg incident. I just think the actual episode itself was not entirely interesting. Like, I didn't really care for his brother, to be honest. Whereas this episode I do really enjoy. I think it was really necessary, and I kind of think this is Enterprise at its best because it deals with consequences of earlier seasons, and that's something Star Trek, particularly shows like Voyager, had issues with because they would often they were so locked into doing episodic storytelling is that they would just erase these events of previous episodes and never reference them again, and so they would seem to have our characters wouldn't seem to be affected by any of these events that we see them experience. So it was great seeing the toll this took on Archer in particular, and also how it kind of affected Earth society as a whole. Now, this episode features 3 storylines. You got the Archer storyline with him going mountain climbing with Herman, and then you have the Tripp and T'Pol storyline where they go to Vulcan, and then you have the storyline with, well, basically everyone else, Phlox, Reed, Mayweather, and Hoshi, as they deal with the xenophobia on Earth. Now, and if you know me, obviously I think that the Tripp and T'Pol storyline is the weak part of the episode, because I'm not a huge fan of Tripp, never have been. I never have been a fan of his relationship to T'Pol, and so having a storyline dealing with that directly, I'm not going to be a huge fan of. But that being said, I don't think it's terrible. Like, it's not like I couldn't bear whenever that storyline came on screen, and I don't think it tanked the episode. But yeah, I would still say it was definitely the weak part of it. But let me get into the Captain Archer storyline first, because I thought this was definitely the strength of the episode. I think this was definitely a headliner of the episode, and I think this storyline did a really amazing job of getting into Archer's head and his character, because I complained, if you've seen the reviews I did for season 1 and 2 of Enterprise, I complained heavily about how Archer came off as a flat, two-dimensional cliche stereotype who's just like, oh, blah, 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 and incompetent as well. And here, he doesn't seem like that anymore. The show's definitely grew a lot more. Here, he does seem like a very complex, complicated, and frankly very interesting character. And I think this episode does an amazing job of dealing with the after effects of having such a stress. I mean, you think about how stressful the Xindi story arc was, where Archer took Enterprise into this dangerous, unknown region of space where the ship was under constant threat, constant attack, and they were completely alone, and they were there to enter a hostile region of space, the Xindi, to deal with them directly, and the stakes were everyone, the human race. Earth could be freaking destroyed and the human race completely wiped out. And they lost more of around a quarter of the crew, I would say. A quarter of the crew died on this mission. And so the toll that would take on Archer would cause him this kind of trauma. And I love that this episode doesn't just wipe it free and just pretend, oh, now let's move on to the next story. That story's done, so let's see what wacky adventure Archer gets into next. I love that they take the time to be like, well, no, because all that trauma would definitely have an effect on Archer, on his character. And I love how because this episode begins is really nice. It shows like this huge like stadium of people like cheering them as heroes, and Archer, of course, you know, kind of, he doesn't want to take the credit. He kind of says, let's remember, if you call my crew heroes, you notice he says that, then I totally agree. Not himself, but his crew. And then he also says that he wants to remember those that have fallen, which really emphasizes how all the casualties they suffered under his command are taking a heavy toll on him. And this makes sense for him being like the first Starfleet captain, because in the earlier seasons I feel like in order to illustrate that he was the first Starfleet captain, they just made him incompetent and not knowing what he's doing. But here I think is a much better use of it, because it shows that losing so many people and having to deal with these high stress situations where they're battling for the survival of the human race, this is new to them. This is not something that the human race, particularly as it is in this stage in development where Earth is pretty much a paradise, they're not used to dealing with this kind of situation, and it's new to them, and it shows the toll that it took on him. And then, of course, he goes into a debriefing with Saval, who, of course, is a dick, as he always is, and it sets Archer off, and he starts yelling, and Forrest has to force him to go on vacation. And he chooses to go rock climbing, and in his own words, it's because he doesn't want to be around people, because he's sick of people idolizing him, saying that he's a hero because he doesn't think he deserves it. And Hermendez forces herself on the trip, or sort of says, oh, I'm coming rock climbing with you. And she's a pretty interesting character, because she apparently she used to serve under Archer, and they sort of had a fling, but it never amounted to anything because he was her commanding officer, and it would be inappropriate. But then, of course, they're not. He's not her superior anymore, so the sparks reunite for this one episode. But I did find their relationship very interesting, and I did like, because she was the next captain of the next NX ship. So at the moment there were only one for most of the Enterprise runs, but now there's going to be another, so there's only going to be two, and so there's only two captains, and they happen to have romantic involvement, but whatever. I guess it's not too far-fetched. Especially seeing how small Starfleet is at this stage. But I found her interactions with Archer very interesting, because she was a very good character. She was kind of like almost a Vic Fontaine Guinan type of character who was nudging Archer in the right direction, but not being too forceful about it. But she was trying to get him to see, she was trying to be very understanding, first of all, but also to get him to move beyond it, which I really liked. Because, and Archer for himself would bring up the fact that the reason why he hated being idolized is because he felt incredible guilt for all the things he did. First of all, for getting a quarter of his crew killed, which of course he blames himself. for most captains would, and also the horrible things he did to other people, like such as torturing those alien marauders. And he specifically brings up the events of Damage, where he stranded a group of innocent, benign aliens. He stranded them in the middle of a dangerous place in order to help his own mission by stealing from them. And I love that they reference that, because you know me, I love that episode. But a lot of people complain that the episode is very un-Starfleet-like, or very un-Star Trek-like, and against the Roddenberry's vision, blah, 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 blah. But here, I think I totally disagree with that, because I thought it showed the kind of desperate situation that it doesn't matter how enlightened, how advanced, how morally superior you are, if you're in that desperate situation where the existence of your entire species is at stake, you'd be willing to do shady things. But Archer still went out of his way to try to minimize the damage as much as possible. But I love how that doing that, because it makes sense that he would do that, even though it goes against entirely his principles entirely, but it would take a huge toll on his character. And I grant this like more than Deep Space Nine when they did In the Pale Moonlight, because they dealt with similar situations where Sisko had to deal with the weight of doing all these immoral things, but he had to, because the Federation was in a desperate situation, but it still weighed heavily on his conscience. But the thing with that is it's only mentioned in that episode, never mentioned again. Here, I love how they do reference it. Of course, I think this is the last and only time they do, so I guess it's not that much better, but it's still better, in my mind, that they do reference that this still weighs on Archer's soul, on his conscience, and it's sort of preventing him from being happy. And then, of course, his whole attitude, the way he views the world now, is through, like, he keeps telling Hermendez that, oh, they should arm the ships more, that you should put more arms, you should put Marines, Makos on the bridge, you should have people with guns, and because he's in this threat mode mentality, because of the experience that he had. Zindi tried to wipe out their whole world, and they were under constant attack and all. And then he retroactively thinks of all the times they were attacked by alien species. And then it gets to the point where he's saying it was stupid for humans to explore because they're just inviting trouble. But I think that was just his. I don't think he ever. I really believe that was just his instinct, his trauma talking. And I think that the episode did a good job of Hermendez sort of calming him down for that, where he can sort of get over that eventually, and on the road to getting over that. And of course, you had that dream sequence, which I actually loved, when they were rock climbing, where he saw like Zindi come and like attack him and throw him off the cliff, and it illustrates the kind of trauma that the PTSD that he's suffering from, which makes complete sense. Now, if I was going to be cynical, I would say this should have touched on this more in later episodes, but it doesn't bother me too much, because this episode did such a good job of addressing that. And then by the end, of course, you get Archer after having his encounter with Hermendez, he was able to work through his stuff and calm down. And Saval actually thanks him for saving not only Earth, but basically said that the Expanse would eventually encompass every planet, including Vulcan. So he thanks him for saving Vulcan and shakes his hand, which is a great moment. And from a sort of meta, like outside of story perspective, I can see this as sort of Manny Koto, because he took over as showrunner for Enterprise in season 4. He was heavily involved in season 3, but he wasn't involved in seasons 1 and 2 at all. That was all Brennan Braga and Rick Berman. And when Manny Koto came on, he really made Enterprise better, quite frankly, to the point where Brennan Braga even said that Manny Koto should have been in charge of Enterprise from the beginning. And I think he's absolutely right about that. And So I can kind of see Saval's like character changing as a result of Manny Koto sort of seeing, because one of the big complaints the first 2 seasons of Enterprise is how the Vulcans were dickheads, and Saval in particular was always a giant asshole. So for him to see like, yeah, that's not working, let's kind of evolve. And I love how he didn't like jarringly like drastically change it and be like, oh, Saval's like, hey Archer, you're a great guy, I love you. No, he was still an asshole in this episode, but they were gradually changing it to the point where we're going to move beyond this. And of course the rest of the season takes this even further to really strengthen the relationship between Archer and Saval in a very natural way. So I give Manny Koto all the praise for that. In fact, this episode was all about, because season 3 of Enterprise was a departure. It was a Xindi story arc where it went in totally different like direction, space, and didn't really involve any of the recurring characters or situations or places that they had in the first 2 seasons. So I love how they did go out of their way instead of just to push it aside, because this is the first time we're seeing Enterprise back in Earth and back in these situations. I love how this episode in particular acknowledges a lot of previous storylines and events from the first 2 seasons. Of course, it referenced season 3 heavily because they're being debriefed. About to mention, brings up the whole thing about the Vulcan ship where they all turned into zombies, violent rage zombies that tried to kill them. Yeah, so I love how it sort of addressed, and the whole storyline with Cass, because this is another thing that T'Pol had a betrothed named Cass. This was mentioned way back in season 1. So again, this episode is acknowledging, instead of wiping out and pretending these first 2 seasons don't exist, which I couldn't blame anyone for actually doing because those seasons weren't good, but instead he acknowledges them, takes them on board, but integrates them into this new, better direction for Enterprise, which is actually a really smart, really well done thing to do. So now, since I mentioned T'Pol, let me get into her storyline with Tripp. And as I said, I thought this was the weak part of the episode, but I didn't think it was altogether terrible, because even though I'm not a fan of the T'Pol and Tripp romance, I didn't really buy it. It seems artificial to me. I think this episode handles it well. I can relate. I think the storyline is very relatable and on an emotional level, that Tripp thinks he's going on a romantic getaway with his new lover, but when they get there, it turns out not to be that, because her mother is actually, because they thought that her mother wouldn't be home, they'd have the house to themselves, but her mother is home, and she's very cold and distant to Tripp and making him sleep on the other side of the house. And so it's not quite what he thought it would be, and then it gets even worse when he finds out that T'Pol's getting married to another man, and he has to deal with that. And I think it's quite obvious that the two have romantic feelings for each other, of course, and I think they both knew on a subconscious level that this was going to be some sort of romantic getaway, but they never acknowledged their feelings for each other, and Tripp chooses not to, even when T'Pol's mother suggests that he does. But this is after, of course, she's chosen to get married, and that's going to happen. So he chooses not to, because it would just complicate things. It would just make her feel worse. She's not, and it does a very mature thing for Tripp to do, which I would say is out of character with him, but that's just me. But I did like that, though. It was a very mature attitude to have. And a very interesting way to look at it. I don't want to get into the whole Vulcan culture here, which seems incredibly misogynistic from a modern Western point of view, with Saval basically using his leverage as having more power in society in order to help T'Pol's mother, using it to force himself to marry her. I mean, he forced her to marry him when obviously she doesn't want to. And I mean, you could argue that he never forces himself on her, and he tries to give her space and lets her return to the Enterprise and be like, look, you'll learn to love me eventually. But he's still forcing her into a marriage that she clearly states clearly she doesn't want to be in. But anyway, like, so that part of it is, and to be fair, this is something that's kind of established in the original series, the Vulcan culture, the whole thing with the Pung Far, and if people can fight each other to the death if they don't want to get married, and the betrothals. So this is not something that's an invention of Enterprise. This is something that's been deeply established in Star Trek canon. I don't think that makes it any better, though. It's particularly when you explore it in such an uncomfortable way, such as this one, with a man forcing her to marry him against her will. But, you know, as I said, I don't really want to get too much into all that. I had to accept that this kind of what's been established, and they're just playing with what's been established. I mean, there's arguments to be made the other way, too, but yeah. Anyway, so this whole storyline was actually fine. Like, I didn't think it was definitely, it wasn't as great as the other storylines, but I do think it's relatable, and I can get it, and I don't think it's terrible. Even though I still would say overall the Tripp and T'Pol relationship was terrible, but this was a decent use of it. Anyway, let me move to the next storyline, which is the Phlox storyline, which, to be fair, we didn't get much of this. We only got a few scenes, but I really liked it. I thought this, because it dealt with how a lot of racist groups have formed and become dominant on Earth. And of course, this was an obvious analogy to the racism and anti-Muslim, which of course we're still dealing with today, but that was particularly rampant after 9/11, and the resentment that a lot of people felt resulted in these hate groups who were taking out the hatred for this one specific terrorist group on anyone of that ethnicity or that religion, and I think that's a powerful message to have, and I think it makes sense in the universe as well, because even like Reed says, oh, it's surprising this would happen in this day and age, and I guess Roddenberry would probably be totally against this too, because it goes against this Earth is a paradise thing. But I don't care how much Earth is the paradise is. If the whole entire species, human race, the entire planet was this close to being wiped out, I'm sorry, but that is going to have an impact on the culture. It is going to change, maybe not mainstream culture, because if you notice, like, mainstream culture is fine. It's just specific hate groups, splinter groups, and of course this will be explored more at the end of season 4, which I honestly didn't think much of those episodes, but they do get into more detail about how there's these white, well, I was about to say white supremacists, but I guess in this situation it would be human supremacists, because it's not about race, it's about aliens now, but that makes sense. And this is actually something that Babylon 5 dealt with, and I thought they did a nice job whenever they dealt with it. And Star Trek presented a different scenario where the human race was enlightened, so they wouldn't do that. But you have a specific situation like this, when their whole planet is almost wiped out by aliens. Yeah. It's a very logical conclusion that you would have some groups like this pop up. Now, this episode doesn't deal with it, specific groups such as like the later two-parter at the end of the season, Demons, and the other one. They deal with specific organized groups. This just deals with, you know, individuals in the populace or who just happen to be very disgruntled because Mayweather and Reed are at a bar with Phlox just enjoying, and this guy comes up and starts being an asshole to Phlox, and obviously the subtext is, wow, I bet you they have good drinks at the Vulcan Consulate, why don't you go back there? Like, and Reed and Mayweather don't want to stand for it, where Phlox is just like, okay, you know, he's a pacifist, he just wants to back down, doesn't want to cause any trouble. Like, okay, I'll just leave now. But Reed and Mayweather is like, no, fuck this guy, he's being a racist asshole, and I'm not gonna let him get away with it. And to be honest, I kind of side with Mayweather and Reed, even though I think the episode wants me to side with Phlox. And I can definitely get Phlox's point of view that he doesn't want violence at all, particularly not on his part. But that guy is being a racist asshole, and so I mean I kind of feel like Reed and Mayweather's reaction was naturally here. And plus, even though they're outnumbered, which is always a cliche when the bar fight happens, that the instigator just happens to have like 4 or 5 friends who want to join in the fight. But Reed and Mayweather's trained by Starfleet, particularly Reed, who was a tactical officer, so I think those assholes didn't stand a chance against them. They were morons for picking a fight with him, and so I think they deserve to get their asses kicked, quite frankly. And not only that, of course, they're racist assholes. But, again, and then Phlox does the whole puffy thing, which is something they just invented for this episode. But I guess the Noblins are a pretty new race, so I'll let them get away with it. Where he puffs up like a puffer fish. He goes, you can see him blowing. And some of the special effects on that, a bit outdated. But it wasn't too terrible. But that... would that really make them stop fighting like that? Because why would that make them stop fighting? I don't know. I don't know, but again, I can see Phlox's perspective. And then when Phlox returns to the Enterprise, Hoshi offers to take him to a Chinese restaurant that he's been dying to go to, and he's like, no, I'm actually just going to hang here. And Hoshi has the attitude of like, look, you can't live in fear. You can't let a few racist assholes control your life. And he's like, you know, he actually was very sympathetic towards the humans who did react this way. He was saying, this is only natural. Your planet was nearly destroyed. I don't want to spark anything, have any trouble. I mean, eventually you'll get to the point where things calm down and be okay, but right now it's a bit too volatile, so I'm not going to provoke anything. Which is really big of him, and I think it does speak very well of his character, but I still don't know that I agree with him. I still think I kind of side with Hoshi and being like, yeah, they may have reasons, but fuck, you aren't responsible. You're not a Xindi. You had nothing to do with the threat of the world, and it's completely unfair for them to take it out on you, and you should not let them, these few insecure assholes, control your life. And I kind of agree with her. If it was me, I probably would have went anyway. But you know, I think it was still a very powerful episode, and a very powerful analogy to make that didn't make a lot of sense, and it was a great way to acknowledge what happened in season 3.
So a new feature on my channel is those who support me on Patreon are welcome to leave their thoughts on a particular episode that I'm reviewing. And Patreon supporter Stephen Kennedy left his thoughts on this episode, Home. Stephen Kennedy says, if Home was the first episode of Season 4 and not the Temporal Cold War, maybe we would have got a Season 5. I'm not actually sure when Enterprise was cancelled. The Temporal Cold War was actually not a bad idea for Enterprise. That story should have been concluded in the middle of Season 4 and not the very start. As Season 3 is one of the best seasons of all of Star Trek franchise, they should have ended the Xindi story in the first episode. So that's a very interesting thought, Stephen. If I remember correctly, I believe Season 4 was canceled towards the end of the season. I think around the time that In the Mirror Darkly came out, and I believe it was more about political reasons rather than quality, but of course that's just what I heard. That could be wrong. But that's a very interesting thought that... I actually agree with you on the Temporal Cold War aspect of it. I've heard a lot of people trash the Temporal Cold War, and I do think this was kind of a speedy way to wrap it up. I do get the impression that Manny Kodo and those in charge of Enterprise Season 4 didn't really want the Temporal Cold War in Season 4, but at least, you know, they did want to wrap it up instead of just pretending it didn't exist, which they very well could have done, because it wasn't touched on for, since we went a whole season without really touching on it. But I do agree that it should have been wrapped up a bit longer. And as I said, we should have gotten an answer to who Future Guy was. And so I do agree that Home should have been the first episode of Season 4, because it is wrapping up the Xindi story arc. And it seems like what happened to him going into the events of Stormfront was kind of an aside and kind of irrelevant. But, they were kind of stuck because they had that stupid cliffhanger at the end of Season 3. They were kind of stuck to continue on with that particular storyline. They would have to put off Home. So I'm actually glad that this episode Home really just addressed the Xindi story arc and doesn't really address the events of Stormfront, which are kind of irrelevant. But on the same token, I agree with you that the Temporal Cold War should have been wrapped up later on, and more devotion should have been paid to it, rather than it seemed like just a quick way to get rid of it. Anyway, thank you, Stephen, so much for your thoughts, and thank you, of course, for supporting on Patreon. So my rating for Home out of 10 is a 9 excellent. I was very close to giving this episode a 10, but the DePaul and Tripp storyline kind of brings it down a bit. I know, again, it's not horrible, and it's actually very relatable, but I'm just not a fan of their relationship, and sometimes their storyline did drag a bit. But the other storylines with dealing with the PTSD that Archer's suffering, and the PTSD that basically the whole planet is suffering, how it's affected the culture and caused them some xenophobic groups to spring up. That, I think, was really well handled. It was a great way to acknowledge and tie up the events of Season 3 and show the impact that it had on the characters, the impact that it had on society as a whole, and not just wipe it from existence with the reset button, to acknowledge that the events we see occur do have consequences. And they did it in a very way that had very strong messages about people suffering from PTSD, and about just fear in general and how it controls society. That relates to some modern situations that America was going through at the time this episode aired. So it's very relevant, very strong character stories. So overall, a really, really great episode. Anyway, so that is it for my review of episode 3 of Season 4 of Enterprise Home. So be sure to check out my channel. At the moment, I should have some polls that are still up for the next batch of Star Trek episodes I'm going to review. So if you want to go vote in those polls, you can check out that video to determine which Star Trek episode I will review next. And be sure to check out my channel for more Star Trek reviews, as well as many more videos and other shows like Lost, The Expanse, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. Thanks a lot for watching.